The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, loving baseball when we were 12 and innocent. My name is Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and my guest today is the esteemed author and podcast host himself, Mr. David Hubler. How are you, David?
I am doing fine. I am really excited about your new series now. It sounds quite...
Oh, yeah, this is fun for me because everybody that does this show is happy to go back in their minds to when they were 12 and what baseball was like for them, the experience of going to games. So let's get into it. Who was the first person that took you to a game?
Well, as in most cases, I think I might have been a little younger, but it was my father, of course. Okay. My family, my mother, father, and even my grandmother were all baseball fans. So the first game I saw, Joe DiMaggio was in his last year. He was playing center field. I distinctly remember it because my father pointed out that that's where he where he will be. We were there before the game started, and he said that's where Joe DiMaggio will be. And of course he was. That was his last season, 51. And so I would have been about 10. And the interesting thing, which I didn't know at that time, of course, and not for later, was that the right fielder was Mickey Mantle. And I did, nobody pointed that out, I'm sure, at the time to any of their kids in the stands. My father certainly didn't. Mickey Mantle was just a rookie. But, I do.
Do you know in that playoff series when the ball was hit between DiMaggio and Mantle in 1950, it was the World Series against the Giants.
Right.
The ball, and Mickey Mantle stepped in the drain.
Drain, that's right. That was on the field. Yep.
Screwed up his knee. He was forever damaged by that one. And imagine what he would have been like if he stayed healthy.
Well, he was fast as it was. I mean, he was, even with the injury stayed with him the rest of his career. He had to be bandaged before every game, I think from ankle up to his thigh because of it. And yet he still was extremely fast on them. And you're right. I mean, no one knows how fast he could have been if he hadn't screwed up the thing. And it was silly. The drain was right there in the field, in the outfield.
Right. That's how crude drainage was in those days, that they could subject a player to that.
Yeah.
But you're talking about 1951, and ironically, I was taken to all three ballparks in New York by my grandfather. In my case, my father was not a baseball fan, but thank God my mother and her dad was, and he told me basically the same thing. He says, this is DiMaggio's last year. Watch him. You'll never see anything like him, because he was, this is before Mickey, Willie, and the Duke. He was the greatest. And
I'll tell you a quick story about that. The game ended with a DiMaggio home run up into the left field stands there. I think the final score was 9-8, but he homered. And many years later, I got to interview DiMaggio in the dugout at Washington at what was then RFK Stadium or Anyway, as we were talking then, I have this picture that I'll never give up of the two of us there together. It was an old-timers day. But anyway, I told him this story that, in the first game, you hit the, and he just sat there with stony faced. I mean, he had no response to this. And I realized that probably just about everybody who ever saw him play and had the lucky opportunity to speak to him, probably had the same stories, a similar story, of course, when they saw him play, what they remembered him doing on the field. So my story was not unique, but I was slightly disappointed that he had no reaction whatsoever to my recounting the game for him.
Okay. Do you remember your first image of Yankee Stadium with the monuments?
Sure. I mean, first of all, it was the field to me was enormous. And I forget who. One of the baseball writers has commented on the magnificence of the green, not just of Yankee Stadium, but every ballpark. When you come in out of the tunnel and you come and you see this vast expanse, Yankee Stadium was about as big as anything I had seen. And of course, in those days, when the game ended, and the ushers would line the first base and third base side right up to the bases, so you couldn't go on the infield, but you could go out through the box seats. There were gates there that would open up, and you could walk out into the outfield to get onto the subway, which was on the other side of the bleachers. There was get exits through the bleachers onto River Avenue, where you could then take the subway back home. And standing there, as I did many times because it was such an awesome sight, Yankee Stadium had this third tier, which gave it a huge seating capacity. But to stand there in center field where DiMaggio was and Mantle and all of these, and the size of now I'd seen a lot of skyscrapers in Manhattan and things like that, but the enormity of Yankee Stadium comes home to you when you're standing out in the outfield and you say to yourself, how in the world could anyone, because you could barely see home plate, anyone see a ball come out of home plate and catch it into this enormous edifice that was there in front of you. It was. I'm sorry they don't do that anymore. It became such an awesome memory in my mind that to this day, I can just recall it completely.
Okay. What comes to mind when you talk about Yankee Stadium is the story you once told me about Charlie Silvera.
Oh, yeah.
Would you repeat that? Because that's a wonderful story.
Yeah. Charlie Silvera was the Yankees' backup catcher for a good number of years. He only played in a few games because Yogi Berra was in front of him. But and in those days, too, again, if you went to Yankee Stadium early while they were having batting practice or just playing pepper or throwing the ball around, you could get right down to the box seats, right to the fence there, and you could sort of yell at the ball players and call them over for autographs. Some would do, some wouldn't. So Charlie Silvera was out there one day, and I called out to him, can I have a baseball? Because in those days you didn't get a baseball. They don't throw them into the stands the way they do now, and just give them away all during the game. But it was hard to get a baseball, and up to that point, I had never gotten a foul ball or a home run, anything like that. So I asked him for a baseball, and he turned to me, and he said, "Kid, if you go to someone's house for dinner, do you ask to keep the silverware?" And I had no answer for that. I always remember that story. I was so saddened when he died, just a couple of years ago now. He was one of the he was one of the last surviving Yankees of that era.
That's a great story. You mentioned Pepper.
Yeah.
Now, I'd venture to say that 90% of the audience, people listening today, don't even know what Pepper is. What was Pepper?
Well, I venture to say that a bunch of major leaguers today don't know what Pepper is because they don't do it. Pepper was the pregame warm-up, I would say. You had three fielders standing close to one another, and a batter, and a ball would be, and they were close together. It was not like infield, outfield. It was right on the sides in the foul territory, and one of the three would lob a baseball to the guy with the bat, and he would sort of bunt it back to them. And they would do this back and forth, where the batter would bunt to the three fielders, let's call them, one at a time. So they would go back and forth, and this was a game called Pepper. In fact, when they started to stop that practice, and I don't know why they did, but I can recall seeing signs on the sides, no pepper, that signs on the infield in foul territory, warning against playing Pepper. I don't know why. So it's totally disappeared now. They might play it in spring training. I don't know, just a warm up. It was just a quick, to build up the reflexes, because it was so close to the batter that you had to really react quickly. And he wasn't bunting it hard, but you just, you had to move your glove around, and I guess it was considered a warm-up exercise.
It was a reflex thing.
Yeah, you're right.
Get warmed up and what have you. Were there people in your family that were anything but Yankee fans? Did you have to make as a decision as a kid who to root for?
No.
Okay.
No. It was the Yankees. My father had grown up in Manhattan, and by logic he would have been a Giants fan. But he was around when they built Yankee Stadium in 1920 or so, 1919 when they started to build it, and for some reason he became a Yankees fan, and I don't recall ever going to the Polo Grounds with him. I had an uncle, my marriage, who was a big Giants fan, and he took me a good few times to the Polo Grounds, especially when the Dodgers were in. And that was a rivalry that is unrivaled.
Oh, yeah.
Unrivaled now. I don't care that the Dodgers are in Los Angeles and the Giants are in San Francisco. It's no longer the rivalry that it was when both teams were in the city and in the same league. Those games were exciting from the very moment they began, and the crowds at the Polo Grounds were intense. You went to Ebbets Field. I never got to Ebbets Field. So
I did. My grandfather's sister, Aunt Sonny, lived directly across from Ebbets Field on Bedford Avenue, and she could look out her window or stand on the roof. I don't remember how they did it, but they could look in to Ebbets Field and see a game. Is a little way a ways, but and that's the one thing my grandfather pointed out. That's Aunt Sonny's building up there. He pointed out DiMaggio in Yankee Stadium, Sonny's building, and when it came to the Polo Grounds, which we started at, we went in 1951, before Willie was brought up.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to watch the team basically change in my first year following going to ball game. And my grandfather would point it out. He'd say, Bobby Thompson is going to third base. Willie is the new guy. And Willie brought such a joy to baseball. That's the only way I can describe it. What made you joyous at a baseball game? What was your favorite part of the whole experience?
Well, early on, of course, it was just being there and watching, being there at the game. It was before we even had a television. So our Sunday afternoons, while we had lunch or brunch, whatever you want to call it, we had this little, I remember this little radio that sat on the windowsill in the kitchen to get better reception. And we would listen to the baseball, listen to the Yankee games on the radio. So you asked about my first impressions of Yankee Stadium. I had no idea what it looked like until we got there. And bang, what an eye opener that was. But listening to the game, to this day, I maintain that listening to baseball on a radio on a summer's day is one of the great joys of existence. There's no other sport that lends itself so well to radio as baseball, because it's slow enough that the announcers can actually tell you what's going on, and the color men, if they're any good, can give you a real insight into what's happening in the game. And then, of course, there were the exceptional announcers who really put themselves into the spirit of the game, and some great announcers. But when television came along in black and white, it was very difficult to see the ball when it was hit into play, because it was just a shade of white and the field was a shade of gray, and so it was difficult. So when you must have had the same experience when you got to the ballpark for the first time, and you saw, and it, even beyond the first time, every time you went into saw this green expanse that was just perfectly manicured. And of course, if you lived anywhere like we did in apartment buildings, we had a couple of good parks right near us, big parks, but it didn't have the green grass, mowed green grass, no bald spots. The grass was uniform throughout that outfield. So it was always a wonderful experience.
When you went for the first time, did you have the feeling, I got to go back?
Well, yeah. I think one of the great seasons, I can't recall which one it was, but it was in the late 50s. A good friend of mine, whose father was the executive editor of the old New York Post, the liberal New York Post, he got us season passes, press passes to Yankee Stadium, and all we had to do, I think we paid like the tax on it was like a quarter or 50 cents, something like that, and we went to many, many games that year. Even if we came in late, we flashed our pass, paid the tax, and then we went. That was a glorious. Of course, I think, if I recall correctly, the Yankees didn't win anything that year, and I always considered myself a bit of a jinx to them. Many games I went to, they lost, and I have to admit that the way I felt as a 10, 12-year-old kid, and of course the Yankees were in the World Series almost every year, that if somebody had offered me
5 years in a row, they won it in those years.
Right. They only lost like 59.
The World Series was a birthright in New York. You're born in New York, you get the. It's just a state of mind. if the Giants weren't in it, and they were once or twice, the Yankees were, and/or the Dodgers for years in a row.
That's right. That's right. It was a New York function, a New York activity. It was a World Series.
Right.
But I was just finishing to say that because I always considered myself a jinx, seeing the Yankee games where they lost so often, that if somebody had handed me a ticket to the World Series, I wouldn't have gone for fear that I would have jinxed them into losing. To this day, I've never been to a World Series game.
Let me ask you, to this day, when you're in Washington and you become a Washington Nationals fan, if the Yankees played Washington tomorrow, would your heart still be with the Yankees?
Oh, of course. In fact, that was proven a couple of years ago. The Yankees did come to Washington for a weekend series, and my cousin, who also grew up as a Yankees fan, he lives in Washington. We went to 2 of the 3 games that they played, and I was rooting vociferously and loudly for the Yankees. I couldn't help but. So I've always said, well, the Yankees are my number 1 team, and the Nationals have become my National League number 1 team.
Okay.
But that's
makes it easier but you have interleague play and what have you.
Yeah.
And reminds me when the Giants left New York 4 or 5 years later, the Mets came into being, and I was kind of torn, back and to this day, if the Giants are playing the Mets, brings up memories of I'll root for the team that maybe needs the game more if they're in a pennant race or whatever. But baseball threw me for a loop when those 2 teams, the Giants and Dodgers, moved.
Oh, yeah.
I was 12 at that time. And the show, this podcast, is entitled Lovin' Baseball When We Were 12 and Innocent.
Mm-hmm.
We lost our innocence a little bit. I did in 57 when the Giants moved, and the Dodgers, of course. There was just a void there. And my innocence was lost with the thought of how could baseball do this to me, to kids in general. But I took it very seriously. I never stopped loving baseball, though. In 58, I rooted as hard as I could for the Braves, who had I rooted for in the World Series. I knew the Giants were gone, and but it just, there was something there that I always think of that loss.
Mm-hmm.
You're lucky your team stayed.
Well, when you think about it, the loss of 2 of the 3 teams was a historic event. I mean, it was unprecedented. In my memory, and going back to the origins of the American League in 1901, the only franchise that switched was the St. Louis Browns moved to Baltimore. I think 1954. And, they moved. We didn't care. The St. Louis Browns were the doormat of the American League. Everybody beat them, except of course, in 44 when they actually went to their only World Series. But the loss of 2 teams in New York the same year, both going to California, was a terrible blow, not only to fans of baseball, I think, but also to the morale of the city itself. New York was considered the city, and and to lose two of its stalwart attractions, mainstays of the city, especially to California, all you think of is just oranges and movies. It was an incredible loss. It was like moving the Empire State Building to Detroit or something like that.
Exactly. I'll never get over it. And
well, you say you'll never get over it. It's funny. Yesterday, I was looking at Facebook, and somebody had pointed out something about being a kid and rooting for the New York Giants. And I've done this several times. I said, like the Swallows at Capistrano, the Giants and the Dodgers are going to come back home. and a couple of people, clicked on a like for that. But I can't help not saying that. I don't believe it, of course, but I like to sort of throw it out there as a possibility. And by the way, let me just mention one other thing as we're talking about this. Right on my wall, opposite my desk, I'm looking at it right now. I have this picture that I bought. It came framed. I think these people were hustlers. I don't know, but it's a picture of the old Yankee Stadium, right facing the front entrance where those little kiosks were, where you picked up your ticket, and it was the big facade and. In the foreground,
the nuns would gather and they'd sit there and they'd snore. I don't know if you remember that.
Nuns?
But right outside of that kiosk, there were a bunch of nuns that...
Oh, collecting. Yes.
Collecting.
Yeah. Well, in this picture, in the foreground are four boys holding bats and gloves, and about the same age that we're talking about, 12 or 13, and they're looking in toward the entrances 3, 4, and 5, the main entrances right there. So I bought it. I bought it totally framed. There's no indication who took the photo, and it's up on my wall. Like I see it every day.
Nice. Do you miss the box scores in the morning, or do you still read them off the computer? In other words,
I read them in the newspaper. I'm still a newspaper person. I can't wait to see the kids dropped off the paper in a driveway in the morning. But of course, for like late night West Coast games, I'll look at them on the computer then in the morning sometime. Yeah, I mean you can tell if you know how to read them, you can tell everything that happened in the game from box scores.
Oh, absolutely, and it just gives you a connect.
Mm-hmm.
It's when I read the papers as a kid, I read them from the back page to the front, where the sports section was.
Right.
And I can remember thinking, I have no interest in anything but the business part of it, what war is going on, this or that. And, pretty much it's the same. Things haven't changed. What do you like about today's game? Everybody that has memories of when they were a kid and how great it was, what's improved, do you say, about today's game? Anything?
Well, I think the players overall are much better as units. I'm not talking individual ball players, but they're faster, they're stronger. They just seem, and there are more teams, of course, now. And it was the original 8 American League and 8 National League teams. There are now 32 teams or 30. There are 30 teams, I think, in the major leagues. And when they talked first about expansion, and they've done this with the other leagues too. The idea is, well, there aren't enough really good players to staff another team, but it's not true. I mean, the teams that have the expansion teams today, of course, can certainly hold their weight in the leagues. So I think that's been a good thing. I don't like the fiddling around. Well, of course, last year was an exceptionally strange year anyway, but I don't like the fiddling around with the game. I don't like making changes to see if that'll the stuff that they've done with especially. Well, we'll talk about that later, a different podcast, but some of the changes that they're thinking of instituting to speed up the game. I don't like this artificial attempt to speed up the game when you know that they're doing it for TV commercials. They're doing it primarily for TV commercials. It's not for the enjoyment of the fan. The real baseball fan loves it the way it is or was. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So I do enjoy watching today's ball players. The thing that I think they miss is not really. Many of them really don't have an appreciation for the past that brought them to the game. A lot of them a lot of them don't remember some of the great ball players of the past, or don't pay homage. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the great announcers, which brings me to something I've been thinking about since you brought up listening to baseball games on the radio. If you go to YouTube and you punch in Yankees on the radio, Yankee radio, that's all you have to do. They have an inordinate amount of games from the 50s that are on the radio. Mm-hmm. So you could get to listen to Mel Allen, Phil Rizzuto, and Red Barber. And they bring back some memories just doing that. David, great show. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thanks. It was a lot of fun. Yeah.
A lot of fun. But the Charlie Silvera story is one of my favorites of anybody of all time. Because I had the good fortune of interviewing Charlie Silvera early on in my somewhat my podcast career, I guess. It's been 10 years of doing this, but I interviewed him in 1995.
Oh, I wish I had been there around.
Oh,
go ahead.
It was for a cable television show that I was doing for Cal State Hayward, and I brought back. Listen to the guys who came in and gave me television time, on-air time. Mm-hmm. Leonard Coppett.
Oh, yeah, sure. He was a big poster.
Silvera,
mm-hmm.
Joe DeMaestri.
Oh, yeah.
Who else? Charlie Fox, who grew up in New York and was a catcher for the Giants in 1940, as early as 1943. Who else?
Wes Westrom?
Hank Sauer.
Oh, yeah.
These were guys who were living out in the area, so I could get them in the studio. It was just terrific for me. Just
I'll bet.
And Charlie Silvera always said, or he said to me then, his idea was Eddie Lopat, Vic Raschi, and
Allie
Reynolds should go into the Hall of Fame as a threesome. That was
good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, that was his. Kind of out of the box. He lived to be into his 90s, and
oh yeah, he was one of the longest surviving Yankees. Silvera, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's hard to believe that Yogi is gone, Whitey Ford is gone.
Yeah.
Silvera, most of them, Mickey.
I did notice in the spring training that I saw a little bit of a Yankee spring training game a couple of weeks back when they first started playing games, and the Yankees are wearing a number 16 on their sleeve for Whitey.
The chairman of the board, he was absolutely all confidence. He was a small guy.
Yes, I was just thinking the same thing.
And I was thinking Bobby Shantz and all these crafty lefties, they wouldn't get a chance in today's game. Everything is big and throw 100 miles an hour and this, that, and the other thing. So, hey, listen, it was nice being 12 years old again.
Yes, I know.
All right. Hey,
it was fun.
Anybody listening, David Hubler is supreme. He is absolutely a gem on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Happy to have you. And we'll be back soon. Thank you for listening, everybody. Happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.